It was late March 1941 when a young soldier named Felix Hall disappeared without a trace from Fort Benning, Georgia. At the time, America was not yet fully embroiled in World War II, but tensions were rising at home and abroad. Within the fortified grounds of Fort Benning, a place meant to shape warriors and instill discipline, a quiet horror unfolded that would take decades to uncover. More than a month after his disappearance, Felix's decomposed body was found hanging in a secluded ravine on the base. His hands were tied behind his back with baling wire, and a noose hung taut around his neck. The conclusion should have been immediate: lynching, murder. But the military called it a suicide. And then they turned the page. The place where he was found was shaded by trees, far from the barracks, near an old sawmill trail where few would wander. The silence around his death was deafening. No announcements, no press release, no funeral with full military honors. For over 7 decades, Felix Hall was a ghost in the system, a name barely whispered, a file tucked deep in archives, a memory left to rot like his body once did in that ravine. Who was Felix Hall? Why did no one hear his screams? And why did the United States Army, a symbol of national unity and courage, let his death vanish into obscurity? Felix Hall's death is believed to be the first documented lynching on a US military base. This fact alone demands attention. But more than a tragic footnote in American history, Hall's story reveals an uncomfortable truth. Even within the uniforms of patriotism and service, racism could thrive. The branches of that tree at Fort Benning held more than a body. They bore the weight of a nation's hypocrisy. The racial tension in the South during the early 1940s was palpable. Jim Crow laws still loomed over Black Americans like invisible chains, segregating everything from water fountains to the front lines of war. And while President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke of fighting tyranny abroad, young black men like Felix faced it daily within the borders they swore to defend. For black soldiers, serving their country was not just about warfare. It was a test of endurance in a system designed to diminish them. When Felix Hall enlisted in the US Army in 1940 at the age of 19, he likely hoped for an escape from poverty, perhaps even a path to dignity. Born in Millbrook, Alabama, Hall came from a working-class black family. Opportunities were limited, education scarce, but the military offered a semblance of structure and promise. It was a chance to be recognized as a man, an equal, a citizen. Instead, he encountered a brutal reality. Fort Benning, like most military installations of the time, was segregated. Black troops were often relegated to menial labor, cooking, digging ditches, carrying equipment. They had separate barracks, mess halls, and latrines. Racist insults were common. Discipline was harsher, and any complaint could be seen as insubordination. Felix worked in a sawmill unit, a place that demanded physical strength and relentless endurance. His co-workers were both black and white, but the power dynamics were unmistakable. Witnesses later described a hostile environment where Felix was frequently targeted and belittled. One black soldier who served with him said Hall was too proud, too quiet. In an institution where submission was demanded, his silence spoke volumes. Then came February 1941. Felix failed to show up for roll call. At first, there was little concern. Soldiers sometimes missed formation for illness or errands. But as days passed, his absence became harder to ignore. A missing persons report was filed. A search was ordered. Nothing was found. Then, on March 28th, 2 soldiers discovered a putrid smell near a ravine not far from the sawmill. There, tangled in tree roots and decay, was Felix Hall's body. The sight was gruesome. His corpse was suspended from a sapling, arms tightly bound behind his back, legs dangling lifeless. The rope had carved deep into his neck. Insects had devoured his features. His dog tags had fallen nearby. He had been dead for weeks. Despite the unmistakable signs of murder, military officials hesitated. The commanding officer on base quickly categorized the death as possible suicide. No suspects were named. No cause was officially determined. No alerts were sent to local newspapers. The body was buried quietly, with little ceremony. It was as if they wanted the story to disappear. And for a long time, it did. But truth, like justice, is not easily buried. In the decades that followed, whispers of Felix Hall's lynching surfaced among civil rights groups and black veterans. NAACP activists questioned the silence. Historians began to dig, and slowly, piece by painful piece, a portrait of racial violence and systemic failure began to emerge. The tree at Fort Benning is long gone. The ravine is overgrown. But the question remains, how could such a crime happen inside the walls of an institution sworn to protect its own? This series will trace every step, from Felix's upbringing to his death, the failed investigation, and the long-delayed quest for truth. We will examine the military's complicity, the media's silence, and the nation's reckoning with its own buried sins. The story of Felix Hall is not just a tale of the past. It's a mirror held to the present. Say his name, not in anger, but in justice. Felix Hall. Before his name would be lost in military paperwork, before his body would be found swaying from a tree in a quiet ravine, Felix Hall was simply a young man with a dream. Quiet, hard-working, and full of questions about his place in a country that rarely answered black men back. Felix was born in Millbrook, Alabama, on January 15, 1922. His family lived modestly, part of a tight-knit African-American community in the segregated South. They attended church on Sundays, picked cotton when necessary, and raised their children to believe in dignity, even when the law didn't reflect it. From an early age, Felix understood that being black in America meant walking a tightrope between survival and aspiration. He was the son of parents who had learned resilience from generations of struggle. His father worked with timber and at the local sawmill. His mother took in laundry and sold pies to make ends meet. Felix, their youngest, was known to be quiet and serious. He didn't cause trouble. His eyes, large and steady, revealed a thoughtfulness beyond his years. Education for black children in Alabama was underfunded and limited, but Felix made the most of it. He learned to read with a worn Bible and newspapers left behind by white families. He asked questions his teachers couldn't always answer, about history, about fairness, about why God made skin come in different colors if people couldn't treat each other the same. By the time he reached 18, options were thin. Local jobs were disappearing, and racial tensions in Alabama simmered dangerously close to boiling. The Army offered something no local mill or farm could: a uniform, a steady wage, and, perhaps most importantly, the promise of respect. When recruiters came to town in 1940, Felix stepped forward without hesitation. Like thousands of other young black men, he believed that service might prove his worth, to his country, to his peers, and maybe to himself. But the military he entered was not a refuge from racism. It was a crucible of it. Fort Benning, Georgia, was where Felix was stationed. It was one of the largest military installations in the country, an engine of training, logistics, and racial segregation. Black soldiers were not allowed to train or sleep alongside their white counterparts. They ate separately, they marched separately, and they died separately, often unnoticed. Felix was assigned to the 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the few units composed entirely of black soldiers. Their duties were grueling and repetitive: cutting lumber, maintaining roads, hauling equipment, tasks no white soldier wanted. It was at the sawmill unit that Felix began to encounter not only exhausting labor, but also daily reminders of his place in the military's racial hierarchy. He kept mostly to himself. Those who served alongside him described him as solemn but polite, never confrontational. One soldier remembered him sitting alone during breaks, sketching small figures in the dirt with a stick. Perhaps they were maps, perhaps they were escape routes, or perhaps they were just a quiet man's way of holding on to himself amid the chaos. There were rumors that Felix had disagreements with white supervisors. Nothing official was ever recorded, but witnesses later said tensions had been rising. He reportedly stood up to one officer who insulted a fellow black soldier. Another time, he refused to follow an order that he considered degrading. In an army that demanded total obedience, especially from its black enlistees, such actions were dangerous. Still, Felix never lashed out. He followed routines, did his duties, and, in letters home, wrote little about his struggles. He didn't want to worry his family. But between the lines, his frustration showed. He told his sister in one letter, "I'm doing my part here, but sometimes I wonder if they see me at all." On February 12, 1941, just months into his service, Felix Hall was seen for the last time by his fellow soldiers. No one knew he was in danger, no alarms were sounded, and when he failed to report to roll call, the response was, at best, casual. For a full month, his absence went mostly unnoticed. Why didn't the Army take his disappearance seriously? Was it neglect, bureaucracy, or something darker? The truth may never be fully known. But what is certain is this: Felix Hall's dream of earning dignity in uniform died long before his body was found. It died in every moment he was treated as invisible, in every task that degraded him, in every voice that called him boy instead of soldier. The uniform he wore was supposed to stand for honor, for equality. But for Felix, it became a shroud, hiding the slow suffocation of his hope. In the next chapter, we will return to Fort Benning, to the moment a foul smell led two soldiers into a ravine, and to the harrowing discovery that would reveal more about America than it ever wanted to admit. Before his name would be lost in military paperwork, before his body would be found swaying from a tree in a quiet ravine, Felix Hall was simply a young man with a dream. Quiet, hard-working, and full of questions about his place in a country that rarely answered black men back. Felix was born in Millbrook, Alabama, on January 15, 1922. His family lived modestly, part of a tight-knit African-American community in the segregated South. They attended church on Sundays, picked cotton when necessary, and raised their children to believe in dignity even when the law didn't reflect it. From an early age, Felix understood that being black in America meant walking a tightrope between survival and aspiration. He was the son of parents who had learned resilience from generations of struggle. His father worked with timber and at the local sawmill. His mother took in laundry and sold pies to make ends meet. Felix, their youngest, was known to be quiet and serious. He didn't cause trouble. His eyes, large and steady, revealed a thoughtfulness beyond his years. Education for black children in Alabama was underfunded and limited, but Felix made the most of it. He learned to read with a worn Bible and newspapers left behind by white families. He asked questions his teachers couldn't always answer, about history, about fairness, about why God made skin come in different colors if people couldn't treat each other the same. By the time he reached 18, options were thin. Local jobs were disappearing, and racial tensions in Alabama simmered dangerously close to boiling. The Army offered something no local mill or farm could: a uniform, a steady wage, and, perhaps most importantly, the promise of respect. When recruiters came to town in 1940, Felix stepped forward without hesitation. Like thousands of other young black men, he believed that service might prove his worth, to his country, to his peers, and maybe to himself. But the military he entered was not a refuge from racism. It was a crucible of it. Fort Benning, Georgia, was where Felix was stationed. It was one of the largest military installations in the country, an engine of training, logistics, and racial segregation. Black soldiers were not allowed to train or sleep alongside their white counterparts. They ate separately. They marched separately. And they died separately, often unnoticed. Felix was assigned to the 24th Infantry Regiment, one of the few units composed entirely of black soldiers. Their duties were grueling and repetitive: cutting lumber, maintaining roads, hauling equipment, tasks no white soldier wanted. It was at the sawmill unit that Felix began to encounter not only exhausting labor, but also daily reminders of his place in the military's racial hierarchy. He kept mostly to himself. Those who served alongside him described him as solemn but polite, never confrontational. One soldier remembered him sitting alone during breaks, sketching small figures in the dirt with a stick. Perhaps they were maps, perhaps they were escape routes, or perhaps they were just a quiet man's way of holding on to himself amid the chaos. There were rumors that Felix had disagreements with white supervisors. Nothing official was ever recorded, but witnesses later said tensions had been rising. He reportedly stood up to one officer who insulted a fellow black soldier. Another time, he refused to follow an order that he considered degrading. In an army that demanded total obedience, especially from its black enlistees, such actions were dangerous. Still, Felix never lashed out. He followed routines, did his duties, and, in letters home, wrote little about his struggles. He didn't want to worry his family, but between the lines, his frustration showed. He told his sister in one letter, "I'm doing my part here, but sometimes I wonder if they see me at all." On February 12, 1941, just months into his service, Felix Hall was seen for the last time by his fellow soldiers. No one knew he was in danger, no alarms were sounded, and when he failed to report to roll call, the response was, at best, casual. For a full month, his absence went mostly unnoticed. Why didn't the Army take his disappearance seriously? Was it neglect, bureaucracy, or something darker? The truth may never be fully known. But what is certain is this: Felix Hall's dream of earning dignity in uniform died long before his body was found. It died in every moment he was treated as invisible, in every task that degraded him, in every voice that called him boy instead of soldier. The uniform he wore was supposed to stand for honor, for equality. But for Felix, it became a shroud, hiding the slow suffocation of his hope. In the next chapter, we will return to Fort Benning, to the moment a foul smell led two soldiers into a ravine, and to the harrowing discovery that would reveal more about America than it ever wanted to admit. March 28, 1941. A humid morning in Georgia, ordinary in every way, until two black soldiers assigned to sanitation detail followed the scent of decay into a wooded ravine behind the sawmill area of Fort Benning. What they found would not only break the silence of the forest, but tear open the buried truth of racial injustice in the United States military. At first, they thought it was a dead animal. The odor was overpowering. But as they stepped closer, parting the brush, they froze. There, hanging from a sapling tree barely thicker than a man's wrist, was the decomposing body of Private Felix Hall. His body was suspended by a thick noose, tied so tightly around his neck that it had cut into the skin. His hands were bound behind his back with wire. His legs were bent unnaturally at the knees. His face was darkened by death and decay, making recognition difficult. But there was no mistaking the uniform, the army boots, and nearby, his dog tags, confirming what they feared. Felix Hall had not deserted. He had been lynched. The discovery shocked the men. They ran for help, and within hours, the scene was swarmed by military police, commanding officers, and investigators. But rather than treating the area as a crime scene, the response was cursory and suspiciously rushed. Photographs were limited. The ground was not secured. The few items found nearby were neither bagged nor catalogued. One officer reportedly remarked, "This looks like a suicide," even before examining the body. This became the Army's working theory. But nothing about the scene supported that claim. Felix's hands were tied behind his back. The rope used to suspend him was thick, military issue, tied in an expert knot. The tree wasn't tall enough for someone to hang themselves in the traditional sense. He had been positioned into a noose and left to die slowly, knees bent, unable to breathe. There were no chairs, stumps, or boxes that could have been used in a suicide setup. There was no note. And his injuries did not match self-inflicted trauma. In fact, an internal Army report noted that death was likely caused by positional asphyxiation, consistent with forced hanging, not voluntary. The local FBI office was contacted, but instead of launching an aggressive investigation, they deferred to the Army. Within weeks, the official conclusion began forming: suicide. Though a military autopsy found evidence of restraint and no alcohol or drugs in his system, the report was vague and inconclusive. The Army notified Felix Hall's family by telegram. No detail was provided, only that their son was dead. His mother, Ella Hall, wrote back in desperation, "How did he die? Where is he buried? Who can I talk to?" She received no answer. Meanwhile, word began to spread among the black soldiers. Whispers of what had really happened circulated through the ranks. One man claimed to have seen Felix being berated by a white officer days before. Another recalled seeing him walk alone toward the woods, but couldn't say whether he had gone willingly. Speculation ran wild. Some believed he had been caught in an altercation with white soldiers. Others suspected a calculated killing, meant to send a message. A few even accused Fort Benning's leadership of covering up hate crimes. But officially, the Army buried the story. No formal press release, no media coverage. Felix Hall's name faded from public record. Even the local papers only ran a few lines, calling it a mysterious death. He was buried in his hometown without military honours. Years later, historians would piece together the events. They would find the military's own documents, autopsy reports, internal memos, many redacted or altered. One such memo read, "This matter should be closed internally to avoid undue scrutiny." Felix Hall became a ghost not only in the forest, but in history. The brutality of what was done to him, the cowardice of those who ignored it, and the complicity of an institution that refused to seek justice became a stain on the US Army's conscience. But his family never forgot. It should have been an investigation, a military procedure, thorough, by the book, relentless in its pursuit of justice. A soldier had been found hanged in a wooded area within Fort Benning, a US Army base. But what followed was not procedure. It was silence. Deliberate, calculated, cold. Within 48 hours of discovering Felix Hall's body, the area was cordoned off. Not to preserve the crime scene, but to seal it. No autopsy was requested. No forensic examination took place. There were no interviews with fellow soldiers. There was no effort to determine what had happened. The Army's initial statement, clinical, dismissive, labelled it an apparent suicide. But how does a man hang himself with his hands tied behind his back? How does he remove his own shoes, knot the rope into a professional noose, and hoist himself off the ground into a position where his feet barely touched the earth? No one asked. Or worse, no one wanted to ask. A memo from Army intelligence dated late March 1941 surfaced decades later. It read, "This matter should be handled discreetly to avoid unnecessary attention or impact on public confidence in the Army." That wasn't an oversight, it was policy. Buried in NAACP records and correspondence are hints of stories never followed. A tip about a confrontation between Hall and a group of white civilians near a worksite. Another claiming he was warned to stay away from a local girl. No leads were pursued. No details were added to official reports. They were erased before they ever had a chance to become evidence. When civil rights advocates demanded accountability, the Army responded with strategic silence. No outright denial, no promise of inquiry, just delays, deflections, and an unspoken hope that time would erase memory. It would take until 1943, 2 full years after Hall's body was found, for the FBI to open a case. But by then, the crime scene had vanished. Witnesses had been discharged or transferred. Records had been misplaced. The FBI's report reads more like a summary than an investigation. One page stands out in its brevity and finality. Body found suspended, identity confirmed, no suspects named, no further investigative steps taken, no interviews with commanding officers, no conversations with Hall's squad mates, no forensic follow-up, no indictment, no justice. The truth is harsher than any conspiracy. It's not that they couldn't find the killer. It's that they chose not to. The military, like many American institutions in 1941, operated as a closed system. It did not tolerate scrutiny. It did not welcome questions, especially about race. The protection of its image took precedence over the protection of its men. Felix Hall wasn't just a casualty of racial violence, he was a casualty of indifference. The system didn't fail him. It ignored him, purposefully. Internal Army letters from the time say more about optics, recruitment morale, and discipline cohesion than they do about the death itself. Not once is the word justice used. Not once is Hall's family mentioned. And they too were kept in the dark. His mother, Rosa Hall, received a brief letter, 1 paragraph, expressing regret for your son's passing. No explanation, no follow-up, no condolence visit. Just a folded page in a government envelope. As World War II raged on, the name Felix Hall faded from the memory of Fort Benning. No plaque bore his name. No anniversary acknowledged his death. No commanding officer ever spoke of him again. For the Army, the case was closed before it ever truly opened. This wasn't simply a lack of evidence. It was the active erasure of a man's life and the crime committed against him. And it was not unique. Hall's death sits among a shameful litany of black servicemen abused, silenced, or killed within segregated military structures, where loyalty was demanded, but dignity was optional. The investigation that never was didn't happen because of a lack of will. It didn't happen because those in power did not want it to happen. To investigate would be to admit something awful had occurred on their watch. And they weren't prepared for that truth. Felix Hall was not just a soldier. He was a human being whose life was deemed expendable the moment he became inconvenient. His death was not just an act of violence, it was a declaration that some lives, even in uniform, didn't warrant the effort of a signature, a subpoena, or a second look. Today, the grounds of Fort Benning, now renamed Fort Moore, continue to train new generations of American soldiers. The cadence of drills echoes across the fields where Hall once walked. And somewhere, perhaps beneath the roots of an old tree, the unanswered questions still linger. Because while the rope may have rotted and the uniforms changed, the truth has never been exhumed. The investigation never came. And that too was by design. They were there. They heard the whispers. They saw the tension rising like summer heat inside the barracks. The way white soldiers flinched when Hall walked past. The stares that lingered too long. The silence that wrapped itself around him like a warning. But when the time came to speak, no one stepped forward. Not officially, not in time, not loud enough. The Army never asked for witness statements. But there were witnesses. Young men stationed alongside Felix Hall in Company A of the 24th Infantry Regiment. Men who saw the quiet insults, the threats muttered behind cigarettes, the unexplained bruises that Hall never reported. They knew he was being watched. Some knew by whom. And at least one saw him walk into the woods on that final day and never return. But history doesn't record their names. In the decades since, fragments have emerged. Slips of memory from oral histories, anonymous interviews, letters buried in university archives. One soldier, years later, told his grandson about a kid who got hung in Georgia. They said it was suicide, but we all knew it wasn't. Another described how Hall had become withdrawn in the weeks before his death, nervous, restless, glancing over his shoulder even in the safety of the mess hall. One account, found in a 1970s civil rights project, recalls a young black recruit being warned not to cross the line. An unspoken line about where he could go, who he could talk to, and which men he should avoid. You could be in uniform, the witness said, but that didn't mean you were safe. Still, in 1941, none of them spoke to the press. None testified. None confronted their superiors. And it's not hard to understand why. They were black soldiers in the Jim Crow Army, a system built to control, not to protect. Speaking up could mean a demotion, a dishonorable discharge, or worse. Many of them had joined the military for a sliver of opportunity, a wage to send home, a uniform that might, just might, shield them from the worst of American racism. But when that uniform failed Felix Hall, they learned what it was really worth. The silence was not just cowardice, it was survival. The white soldiers said even less. Some mocked the death behind closed doors. Some avoided the subject entirely. Others repeated the Army's line. He hung himself. End of story. One sergeant reportedly warned the platoon not to stir things up. Another officer circulated a message discouraging gossip that could damage morale. In this atmosphere, the truth was not just buried, it was crushed under the weight of command. What happened at Fort Benning in 1941 was not only a lynching, it was a coordinated forgetting, a collective decision, silent but unanimous, that Felix Hall's death would not matter, that no one would be punished, that everyone would move on. And so, they did. The witnesses scattered, some deployed to Europe, some discharged into civilian life. Some carried guilt, others carried secrets. A few spoke, but not until it was far too late. By then, memories had faded, names were lost, and the army had long since closed the file. The tragedy is not only that Felix Hall died, but that the people who could have told his story chose, or were forced, to forget it. Yet memory has a way of leaking through the cracks, and even silence can leave fingerprints. In recent years, historians, journalists, and descendants have begun to piece together the fragments. A private letter here, a diary entry there, an old photograph with a handwritten caption. Benning, 1941, before the boy was found. Some of the forgotten witnesses are long dead. Others are still nameless. But their silence still speaks volumes. It tells us what it cost to tell the truth. It tells us who was expected to remain invisible. And it tells us that justice delayed, when paired with silence, becomes something more dangerous: erasure. Felix Hall's story survived, not because the system protected it, but because it was too painful for some to carry quietly. In that pain, in those half-spoken memories and late-night confessions, the witnesses left behind a map. Not of answers, but of echoes. They may have been forgotten by the army, but they left behind a trail. One we're only just beginning to follow. For years, the official story fit on a single page. Felix Hall, age 19. Private, Company A, 24th Infantry Regiment. Found dead, March 28, 1941. Apparent suicide. Case closed. But history is rarely so neat. And in the shadows of filing cabinets and locked drawers, the truth was waiting. It would take decades before anyone thought to look again. And when they did, when journalists and researchers started pulling threads, the documents began to tell a different story. One of omissions, one of contradictions, and one of deliberate silence. The first red flag was in the autopsy report, or rather, its absence. Despite being found in suspicious circumstances, no autopsy was ever performed. No coroner's inquest, no forensic photographs. Just a single typed memo stating no foul play suspected. But the Army's internal memos, when finally declassified, tell a different tale. A 1941 communication between the Fort Benning Provost Marshal and a superior in Washington notes concern over optics and recommends internal handling of the case. Another memo, stamped confidential, warned, "This incident should not reach the press in its present state. Further visibility may create unnecessary tensions within Negro enlistment." So it wasn't just neglect, it was strategic concealment. The personnel files of Felix Hall were also incomplete. Pages were missing, disciplinary records redacted, notes from his superiors vague and inconsistent. One line in his last evaluation simply read, "Good worker, keeps to himself." There was no mention of any incident, conflict, or medical concern. No reason, on paper, for Hall to end his own life. Yet in the archived correspondence between military legal officers, one chilling phrase appears again and again. Avoid setting precedent. Precedent for what? For admitting that a black soldier had been lynched on federal land? In a 1943 Internal Army legal review, the matter is described as sensitive and recommends no further action unless external pressure demands it. In other words, they would act only if someone forced them to. No pressure, no justice. Even more revealing is a suppressed letter found in the National Archives, never mailed, from a military chaplain stationed at Fort Benning. It was addressed to Hall's mother. The chaplain wrote, "I do not believe your son took his own life. I cannot say more, but I hope someday the truth is allowed to be told." The letter was never sent. It was filed, forgotten, hidden. Somewhere along the way, Hall's death transformed from tragedy into inconvenience. And the paper trail reflects that shift, from handwritten concern to clinical erasure. In a military culture obsessed with hierarchy and order, there was no place for chaos. No room for a black soldier's unexplained death to disrupt the machine. So the documents were sanitized, evidence diluted, context deleted. But even redacted, the shadows remained. Today, thanks to persistent historians and FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, pieces of the story have been recovered. Memos, unsigned drafts, whispered concerns typed in carbon copy. They're not enough for a trial, but they're more than enough to indict the system. What do these documents prove? That Felix Hall was never given a fair investigation. that the army prioritized reputation over truth, that behind every official form there was a human cost, and that cost was hidden under signatures, stamps, and silence. There is a term historians use: archival violence. It means the harm done when stories are erased, when records are withheld, when power decides what is worth remembering. Felix Hall was a victim of that violence too. Not just the rope, not just the tree, but the paperwork that buried him. We think of archives as sacred, but sometimes they are cemeteries, full of things left unsaid, waiting to be exhumed. She kept the letter in a drawer, folded, worn at the creases, the ink fading slowly with time. It was the only official word Rosa Hall ever received about her son. One page, typed. No answers, no apology, just a confirmation her son was dead. They didn't even send the body home. The army shipped a plain casket to Louisiana, sealed. No viewing, no ceremony, no explanation. Rosa asked if anyone had spoken to Felix before he died. No one had. She asked if there had been an investigation. There hadn't. And just like that, silence fell. Not only from the government, but from neighbors, friends, and even the church. Because when a black mother in 1941 buried a son who died under unclear circumstances in the army, she was taught not to ask too many questions. But questions were all Rosa had. She asked them in prayers, in dreams, in letters she never sent. To her husband, who had once been proud that Felix volunteered. To her surviving children, who grew up knowing their brother died not at war, but in uniform, and still alone. For years, Rosa refused to change Felix's room. His boots stayed by the door, his Bible on the shelf, a photograph on the mantelpiece, a quiet boy with deep eyes in a stiff uniform, not yet hardened by the world. The family knew more than they said. Even then, whispers had reached Millwood, that he'd been lynched, that it was covered up, but no one dared say it aloud. Not in the South. Not when saying the wrong thing could bring the rope closer to your own door. Still, grief has its own language. One of Felix's younger sisters stopped speaking for a time. His father, once a man of steady words, grew quiet. When someone from the county office came years later offering a military plaque for Felix's grave, Rosa shut the door without a word. She didn't want a plaque. She wanted her son. The loss of Felix became a silence that lived in the walls. His name was spoken in hushed tones. Visitors rarely asked. Even relatives avoided the subject. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to carry that kind of grief. A death like that doesn't end with the burial. It echoes across generations. Felix's nieces and nephews grew up seeing the photograph, hearing fragments. Your uncle died in the army, someone might say. But it wasn't until decades later, through books, articles, and records long buried, that they began to uncover the real story. And with it, a new pain. The realization that the truth had always been hidden, that their family had been told to accept a lie and call it honor. One grandniece, in an interview years later, said, "We didn't even know what questions to ask, but we always felt something was missing, like we'd inherited a silence no one could explain." When historians finally contacted surviving Hall relatives in the 2000s, they were hesitant. Who were these strangers asking about a long-dead boy? Why now, after all this time? But when they heard the story, the full story, the silence began to break. And something else emerged: pride. Because Felix hadn't just been a victim. He had been brave. He had served. He had endured. In 2021, over 80 years after his death, the Department of Defense finally acknowledged what had happened to Felix Hall, that he was lynched on Army property, that the investigation had been negligent, that the family had been denied truth. A memorial plaque was placed. Officials made statements. But Rosa Hall was long gone by then. She had died decades earlier, never having heard the words she most deserved. We were wrong. Still, her legacy lives on, in the resilience of her family, in their insistence on remembering, and in the image of a mother who refused to let grief be rewritten by bureaucracy. Felix Hall's death was a wound, but his family, through silence and survival, became the scar that would not disappear. Because some stories don't fade. They wait. In drawers, in bloodlines, in memories that refuse to stay buried. It wasn't just the army. It wasn't just Fort Benning, or one commanding officer, or one coroner who failed to act. It was the system, vast, layered, and indifferent, that swallowed Felix Hall. A system that knew how to make things disappear. From the moment Hall's body was found, the mechanisms of silence began turning. Not with violence, but with protocol. With forms unsigned, with questions unasked, with the cold efficiency of bureaucracy choosing not to care. The coroner signed the death certificate without a full examination. The press printed nothing. The NAACP received no reply. Congressional inquiries were ignored. And within the War Department, the message was clear. Do not escalate. Do not admit fault. Do not break the silence. In 1941, America stood on the brink of war. National unity was the mantra. Patriotism, the armor. There was no space in that narrative for a black soldier lynched in uniform. Not if the country hoped to rally men of every color into service. So they buried the story to save the cause. White newspapers didn't run the headline. Black newspapers weren't given access. Editors who might have investigated were denied sources or brushed off. Local officials in Georgia, still steeped in segregationist power structures, had no interest in digging up what they had quietly allowed to happen. Even the FBI, tasked with enforcing federal law, walked away. Their own internal review noted potential complications with pursuing the case and suggested that further involvement could damage relations between military and civilian jurisdictions. Translation: leave it alone. Felix Hall didn't just fall through the cracks. He was pushed. The army moved on. Training resumed. Bases expanded. The war effort surged forward. And behind it, the blood on Georgia soil dried beneath marching boots. No soldier was ever suspended. No commander was questioned. No legal tribunal convened. It was as if the lynching never happened, because the system made sure it couldn't be proven. This is what institutional silence looks like. A chain of inaction dressed up as order. A tragedy reclassified as inconvenience. A dead man's truth suffocated by paperwork. And that silence wasn't just passive, it was policed. Black soldiers who asked questions were warned to keep their heads down. Community members who pushed too hard risked backlash. Rosa Hall's family knew, if they demanded too much, they might be made to regret it. That is the genius of systemic silence. It doesn't just erase the truth, it teaches you to help erase it. Year after year, the case remained dormant. Not because no one cared, but because those who cared had no power, and those with power refused to care. And yet, the documents remained, hidden, misfiled, whispering. The system couldn't destroy everything. It could only delay, and delay became policy. By the time researchers in the 21st century reopened Felix Hall's story, they found themselves in a maze of missing pages and redacted lines. But even there, in the gaps, the truth spoke. It spoke in what wasn't said, in what should have been written and wasn't, in what justice should have looked like, and what it never did. The silence around Hall's death was not a failure of communication. It was a failure of morality at every level, from the barracks to the Capitol. His lynching was allowed to fade because those in power made that the easier choice. But silence is not neutral. It's not harmless. It kills, just more slowly. Felix Hall was 19. He had no trial, no defense, no last words recorded, and for more than 80 years, no one paid for what was done to him. Because systems are not built to correct themselves. They are built to protect themselves. For 80 years, Felix Hall lay in the shadows. His name was not taught in classrooms. His face was not etched in marble. His story, a soldier lynched in uniform on American soil, was never spoken in official ceremonies. But truth has a long memory, and justice, though late, does not always forget. It began slowly, with a footnote in a report, a question in a classroom, a name scribbled in the margin of a historian's notebook. People began to look again, not just at Felix Hall, but at what had been done to him, and more importantly, what had been done to keep us from knowing. In 2021, after decades of silence, The Department of Defense acknowledged the truth. Felix Hall had been lynched while serving his country. An official memorial plaque was placed. Government officials issued a statement. But there was no parade, no medals, just a few solemn words carved into metal and a quiet gathering of people who had waited too long to hear them. For Hall's extended family, many of whom had only learned the full story recently, it was a moment of mourning and resolve. One said, "This isn't closure. This is permission to begin telling the truth out loud." Recognition didn't undo the crime. It didn't erase the pain or give Rosa Hall the answers she never received. But it opened a door for education, remembrance, and resistance. And that's what stories like Felix Hall's demand. Not just sympathy, but responsibility. Because this isn't just about one soldier in 1941. It's about every time a system says, your life doesn't matter enough to investigate. Every time silence is chosen over truth. Every time power protects itself instead of the people it serves. Felix Hall's death reminds us of the cost of that silence and the importance of those who break it. Today, you've heard his story, but it doesn't end here. Not unless we let it. If this moved you, if it made you think, if it made you angry, don't let that stop at the screen. Leave a comment. Tell us what this meant to you. Share this story so others know Felix Hall's name. Subscribe for more forgotten truths like this, because history needs witnesses. And if you believe stories like this matter, hit like. It helps others find what was once buried. Let's make sure the next Felix Hall isn't forgotten. Not again, not ever.